Hello and welcome. I am Dr. Lara May, a clinical pharmacist specializing in functional medicine, as well as a certified yoga teacher and Reiki master. I run a truly integrative health coaching practice encompassing functional medicine lab testing, yoga and meditation, and a sprinkling of Reiki energy medicine. Join me here on Light Body Radio to break through your health plateau and come into alignment with your natural vitality. Hello and welcome to Light Body Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Lara May, and today we have with us Allison Yamamoto. She is the founder and CEO of Ally, which is it Ally or Ally?
Ally.
Ally. Which helps women stop overtraining or underfueling in order to feel empowered in their bodies. So I'm going to just go ahead and jump right in and ask you to tell us about how your story, how you got started, and being really passionate about this.
Yeah, so a little bit more about me. I come from a background where I've always been really active. And so growing up, I was interested in sports. I ended up doing some dancing eventually, getting into cheerleading, and then cheering throughout college. And I also was interested in my health. So I was someone that wanted to do well in school, do well when I was navigating my food and my exercise, to be someone that was healthy. And I also tended to be someone that put really high standards on myself. And once I graduated from college, I went through a period where I didn't really have a lot of structured exercise anymore. So I got super into running. And I started by probably a fairly typical running journey where I was running shorter distances, and then that's sort of a gateway to longer distances. And eventually I was running half marathons and marathons, which I loved doing. And I was also still very interested in my fitness and my health at that time. And what ended up happening is I got into a state where I was experiencing menstrual disruptions, and I would occasionally feel like really burnt out during my workouts, but I was also really disciplined. So I would continue to push through and adhere to my training. And over the course of several years, I started learning a lot more about overtraining and underfueling and what that looks like and what the implications of that can be. And I also realized that there was a huge prevalence amongst women, especially, to experience overtraining and underfueling without knowing it, especially because of how we talk about it or how we might be basing our diets based on information that wasn't really catered towards or intended towards women, especially women that are exercising in any way. And so once I started getting more educated about that, that's really what inspired me to create the program that we have today, which is helping women that are experiencing similar issues and to essentially navigate in a way that also is going to be healing for their hormonal health, for their bone health, for their mental health even, as well as to develop a more freeing relationship when it comes to how they're navigating food and also exercise amidst a culture where there can be so much pressure.
For sure. So what does it look like, just to clarify, in case, because I'm sure there's somebody out there listening that thinks like, oh, this probably doesn't apply to me. But I would maybe venture to say that we are not, like you just said, well informed on what it looks like to be underfueling and overtraining.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I usually like to break it up into like, what are the signs and symptoms? And also, what are some of the behaviors? Because
Mhm.
sometimes, as women, especially, we can be conditioned to question and to just push through a lot of the signs because they're not chronic enough for us to feel like they deserve or necessitate immediate medical or any sort of change in lifestyle or any sort of attention. But some of the signs that we would typically see in somebody who might be overtraining is everything from decreased motivation to feeling really cold really easily to major changes in like your mood, and especially like how you might be feeling a little bit more irritable. You might be thinking about food more often, all the way through to feeling like you're getting injured really frequently, or your immune function might be disrupted so that you're getting sick more often. And so those are some of like kind of like the physiological signs, and there actually are several. It could even be impacting your digestion. It could be causing irregularities in your periods, so that they're shorter or longer, or maybe they're absent for especially for sustained periods of time in more severe cases.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that was the major red flag for me, was that I was missing my period altogether. And I was being told that, well, if you're not trying to get pregnant right now, today, then that's not really a big issue. And little did I know that that's actually one of the major red flags when you're in a more severe instance of this. And so you can actually use your menstrual cycle as really helpful feedback about whether or not, okay, if there are disruptions, should I be thinking about my nutrition? Should I be thinking about my lifestyle and my stress and my exercise as things that could be contributing to disruptions that I'm experiencing in my menstrual cycle? And so as women, we're actually really lucky in that we get that feedback loop. But then there's also behaviors. And I think that you put it really elegantly, which is that a lot of times women are not elite athletes training at like the Olympic level, and therefore they don't think that there's any possibility that they could be experiencing some of these issues, especially when it comes to training. And yet overtraining is essentially a state where you're not allowing your body appropriate amount of recovery. And so that could look like maybe you're doing really high intensity exercise classes back to back. It could look like you're exercising repeatedly when you're chronically getting not enough sleep. And there are signs, and what I think is really interesting is that there's a bigger prevalence now with tracking devices and how much data we can get back from the various tracking devices we have. And sometimes those will give feedback about whether you're overtrained or not, but it's really empowering to actually know how you can assess that within yourself, because that data isn't always super and the most accurate based on where you are in your cycle, or based on how you're actually feeling, or some of the other factors that you're bringing into play, like how stressed you are or what else is going on in your life. So that's kind of on the overtraining side. On the underfueling side, it could be anything. And I think that the prevalence or the propensity to take on any sort of diet or to try to eat really clean could be some of the most obvious behaviors. But this isn't even in extreme cases where there's some sort of like, there's some very extreme diets out there right now that are like very restrictive in terms of the types of things that you can eat. But for women, even some of the like the everyday dietary kind of health related, I'm putting that in air quotes, advice that people give out could actually put someone into a state, especially women, where they're underfueling because they're trying to, for example, intermittent fast, which is something that gets a lot of attention in the media as something that's objectively really good. And yet it's something that was only studied on a specific population. And in many cases, especially for women, it's not relevant and could be putting your body into unnecessarily states of chronic stress that could be putting you in a state of underfueling. And ironically, the people that are doing that might be trying to do it for weight loss, or trying to do it to be healthy, or trying to do it to be fit. And we don't realize that that's the type of lifestyle modification that could even cause our bodies to think that we're in a survival state and then release more cortisol. And if anything, it's going to promote fat storage. And so it was kind of this journey where a lot of women may be underestimating how vulnerable we could be to falling into some of these patterns that are ultimately not really beneficial for our health or for our like kind of mental well-being and fitness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important for just to even reiterate that so much of our nutritional and fitness data has not been specifically studied in women. And so, I mean, there's a lot of fabulous scientists and researchers that are doing it now. And so, but now we're still just now getting that information. And so it's really important to listen to your body and to, I think, like, cycle through some things. Just like as women, we have a cycle, our menstrual cycle, but like, it's hit training is fine, but not every day. And intermittent fasting is fine, but not every day. Like, give, because our body also loves that variability. And that's also one of the reasons why cross training is so important. But allowing ourselves to have that zone 2 day where we just go for a nice cardiovascular hike or walk, or swim, so it doesn't have to be balls to the wall all the time in order for it to be quote unquote productive.
Yeah, and I think that you said that so perfectly, which is that in any sort of training regimen, and especially even like the most elite of the people that are training, there is productivity in rest. There's productivity in the recovery days, there's productivity in the rest days and the easier days. And it actually does require discipline to go out and do a session and not be at your 10 out of 10 when there's standards that you might expect based on what you're seeing other people do or what you're hearing about what quote unquote counts as exercise. And especially when we're busy and we want to get something in and we want it to be the best use of that time, it's totally understandable of the pressure to feel like, well, I'm just going to go as hard as I can because I only have so much time to do this and I need to fit it in. It needs to be the most effective. And we don't realize that that thought pattern is actually potentially harming us in how we're thinking of a more holistic view of, to your point on what are we doing day to day and how does that add up and accumulate over time. And I think it's interesting because the advice of, all right, listen to your body, it is correct in the sense that there's so much power in being able to understand what those signals are and how to respond to them.
Mhm.
And yet I think that there's also the reality that how we're navigating exercise and nutrition is one of hundreds of things that we're thinking about every single day. And so there's a bias often towards, okay, well, realistically, how many of these signals am I going to be able to tune into? And it's easier for me to just fall into this routine that I have. And there's the reality of the day to day that makes it hard to know what does listening to my body even look like. And in many cases where we've followed something that was super regimented, whether it was because we were going to fitness classes or we were following a training plan, or maybe because we were following a certain diet, it's almost a journey that we have to go on to then relearn how to listen to our body. What does that mean? What does that look like? Especially in cases where sometimes listening to your body actually does mean not necessarily listening to every single hunger cue and only eating based on certain standards of what you're experiencing. But sometimes it could mean, hey, I'm about to go out for to go training and it might be higher intensity. And I'm going to have a snack beforehand because I know that my hormones and my body is going to respond better to that, even if it's not meeting some criteria I have in my head about quote unquote listening to my body in terms of the amount of hunger that I'm experiencing right now, because we often affiliate that with physiological hunger. And so I just bring that up because it's something where for me and in my journey, especially, and with a lot of the women that I'm working with, listening to your body is one of the huge goals of a lot of women. And that's something that is not necessarily from day one we're expecting is like, all right, good luck. Now you're listening to your body. That's your assignment for this week, as much as it's something that is something we have to practice and we have to learn and
Yeah.
feel empowered with the information that only allows us to do that.
For sure. I definitely think it's cultivated over time because we were trained out of it. Let's just be
Exactly.
real. I mean,
Yeah.
like I started my athletic career in elementary school as a swimmer and went all like you all the way through college being competitive. And even, post college, I was competitive in other ways with running and triathlons and things. And so it's actually easier for me to adhere to a training regimen than it is to listen to my body and rest when I'm supposed to and take those zone 2 days. And for maybe some of you out there, if you haven't heard of this phenomenon or this idea of zone 2 training, it's very it's when you can maintain a conversation while doing what you're doing. So it's actually even before like zone 3 would be considered that cardiovascular range of your heart rate. So it's also based on a heart rate range, which is relative to your age. So it's helpful to have some sort of heart rate monitor, but you don't have to because you can gauge in yourself. Like if I'm walking along and you and I are carrying on a conversation, that's zone 2, probably for the most part. If you start to feel a little winded or your heart rate it goes up and you're maybe breaking a sweat, that's probably zone 3, but you can still maintain it. when you're starting to feel the burn, that's your lactic acid threshold. And so that would be zone 4, if I'm counting correctly. Correct me if I'm saying anything that's inaccurate or wrong, please.
No, that sounded right. And I think that the interesting thing about the zone training is, to your point, you can do it based on a heart rate monitor, and you can combine that with what you mentioned, which is feedback about how you're actually feeling. Because
Mhm.
on any given day, you might, if you know, okay, zone 2, that sounds like something, it feels like something in my body where I'm able to have a conversation. It's really empowering then to be able to match how you're working out to how you're feeling, and to be able to use that scale, even if you don't have a heart rate monitor, to say, okay, I'm going to go out for a intentional run, and that might be threshold, and therefore I'm going to go for a zone 4, versus I did a harder workout yesterday, I'm just going to go in for a nice easy run. And there's a huge amount of purpose in that. And especially if you're training for, let's say, like a marathon, a triathlon, any sort of
Mhm.
event, even cycling, running, swimming, one of those like cardio based activities, it can be really, really, really helpful to incorporate what you're mentioning in terms of zone based training, and even like RPE, which is like perceived exertion, into your training. But if you're not, and I think that this is where I find it to be so interesting, which is that a lot of the women that are actually struggling with overtraining are not the ones that are following a training plan, because oftentimes baked into that training plan are, okay, here is your rest day, and here is when you're going to go harder, and here is when we're going to ask you and intentionally go easier. And that's because a lot of the training plans over time, when you're training for an event, are periodized in and of themselves, which essentially means that we're already taking a long-winded view of how you're training. And so it's actually the people that are not necessarily training for something that sometimes fall into the patterns of overtraining, because it's way easier to be like, oh, I don't even remember what I did yesterday, or this class looks great, so I'm going to do this class. And then the next day, I'm going to do this class again because that class felt great yesterday. And then that's when we get really hung up into these notions of, oh, maybe I was actually in my zone 5 for a period of that class, and we never actually realized it because I just was doing whatever the instructor was telling me to do, or because this just
Mhm.
seemed like the most efficient use of my time during that workout.
Yes. I will say though, I've come across plenty of workout plans that only have 2 days of rest baked into them. And if you're doing high intensity and or lifting heavy weights, so in the last like 5 to 8 years, I've started backcountry hunting. And training for that is so specific because it does involve, if you're successful at harvesting an animal, then you have to carry it out. And that's a lot of weight, especially for a female. And so you have to be very cognizant about how much weight you're putting on your body, again, to prevent injury and harm to yourself. But at the same time, you're training to carry and lift heavy weight. And so, I've seen a lot of these training programs that are, I think, again, are just geared towards men. Men don't, I don't think, I could be wrong, but I don't think they need as much rest as we do because they don't have a menstrual cycle. So they're not having these hormone fluctuations that we have. And I think that is something to definitely take into account. Even if, you're not a seasoned athlete, but you're getting into something like this, it's definitely, again, this coming back to this listening to your body. Where are you in your cycle? Those first couple days of your menstrual period, maybe those are the days you tone it back a little and don't push as hard, because most of the time we're tired on those days and we don't feel good and we're bloated and cramping and all the things. And so like, give yourself some grace, and that's okay. And know that, later on in that week, you can push harder because you'll just naturally have more energy. And so, I think also, like I think we've said, but like, just going with that natural flow and knowing that it's okay, that we are our own worst judge or harshest critic, and that there's really no one else out there that's like judging us as harshly as we are.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it's super, to your point on like just there being so much out there in terms of what is relevant to me, what isn't relevant to me, is this only applicable to men? And I think that one of the things that I do like to remind women is like the when you are listening to your body, and to your point, your symptoms will change throughout the course of your cycle, absolutely. And it is person dependent. And so sometimes to your point, it might be the first few days of your period. It might not be. It might actually be some days leading up. It might be that you feel great. And that's going to be a really helpful feedback loop, because unlike men where it's like they're just kind of like cycling day to day, they have this, I saw this interesting quote that essentially said, men, we recycle 24 hours, and women aren't like that. We're cycling over the course of our menstruation, which is over that several day, month long cadence. And it's true that you can do a great and powerful workout any single day of your cycle. So if you have a race day and it's whatever that day is of your cycle, you are 100% capable of, as a woman, showing up and performing really well. And there could be, to your point, reasons why you may feel more off, and it's okay to be able to honor those things too. And I feel like, especially women, like it sounds like you and I and many others who are putting a lot of pressure on ourselves, it can be hard for us to be more forgiving of ourselves when we can't exactly explain why we could do this workout last week, or we could do this workout a few days ago and now it's different. And that's not a failure. It's just something that is inherent and natural. And it's okay to, quote unquote, listen to your body and say, I'm going to actually go easier, or maybe even take rest, knowing that that's actually going to help my performance tomorrow or next week or the next day, and having that trust, which can be really hard to develop. So yeah, and I'm super fascinated by what you're training for. I think that would be interesting. But resistance training, I will say, I will put a little plug in, because you're mentioning lifting heavy weight, which is, resistance training is great for women.
Oh,
So
absolutely. I'm a huge proponent. Yes. Especially as we get older, don't stop, because it's great for bone health and building bone strength. But even as we get older, it's even more important to maintain muscle mass, especially as our estrogen levels start to drop, because that goes into how we manage glucose in our body, which you'll see that a direct reflection on your body as to how you carry weight. So one of the most frustrating things as women get older is to have that little inner tube middle that they just can't seem to get, rid of in those perimenopausal and early menopausal years. And a lot of that has to do with indolent glucose intolerance and insulin resistance, because our insulin levels are starting to drop. What helps mitigate that? More muscle mass on your body. More muscle mass on your body means you also have a higher basal metabolic rate, which will help you burn more just at rest. So yes, lifting heavy things is important. Don't stop doing it. And if you haven't started, it's okay. It's never too late to start.
Yeah, it is very true. And I think that with, because you're mentioning with bone health, and I think that that's one area where I think that especially for really young women, it can feel like a very abstract concept, even for, older women as well. I think that for women in general, it can be a very abstract concept, because there's a lot of talk about, oh, our bone health, we need to be really cognizant of our bone health. And yet the consequences of that can sometimes seem really far away or really abstract, which is fractures, usually later in life. But if you are an athlete, especially if you're doing any sort of high impact training, and that could be like running, for example, getting something like a stress fracture is an injury that it's notable. It'll impact, several months on recovery potentially. And that is one of the things that you are more at risk of impacting your bone health in a negative way if you are in a state where you are overtraining, and especially if you are underfueling. And for women especially, this matters because, to your point, we are going to experience with age a degradation in our bone. And so we want to maximize the chances that we're resilient and our bone strength is good. And that's one area where, if you are undertraining or overtraining or underfueling, that it will impact your bone health, which is increasing the risk of injury, but it also has long-term consequences about what your bone is going to look like later on in life.
Yeah, so let's sort of transition into actual food. So let's talk about macros and how much, we need to be fueling with relative to maybe what we're doing or not doing.
Yeah, so I love this concept of energy availability. And I think that oftentimes we get really caught up in this notion of calories, calories in, calories out.
Mhm.
And then there's all these diets that are essentially saying, okay, well, this macro is going to cause, is a good macro, and this macro is a bad macro. So you have to avoid that macro. And all of that thinking can be harmful or potentially just irrelevant for women in a way, because I really like to go back to this concept of energy availability, which is essentially saying, what is the available energy through food and nutrition that you have throughout the day? And so instead of thinking of it as an equation, because oftentimes an equation would assume that, okay, well, if I just skip breakfast, don't snack at all, and then eat a lunch, and then maybe just start, and then maybe I have a lot of time in the evening, and I just eat a lot in the evening. And that could also be a disruption in how our hormones are responding to that. And so one of the fundamental concepts when I'm thinking about nutrition and talking to women about it is this concept of energy availability, which is saying, how are we providing our body with a steady stream of well-balanced nutrition that is allowing it to balance our blood sugar, but also to build trust within our body that is allowing our holistic body to understand, and especially our hypothalamus, that we can produce the hormones that we need to be producing, and we're not in a survival state. And so then to your point back to like, that is good for our estrogen levels. It's good for us to be able to cycle regularly because we have that energy availability. So that's kind of like the one side when we're asking about how do we know that we're having enough. The first principle on that I like to talk about is energy availability, which means that the timing of when we're eating does matter. And it does make a difference, and our body will respond to that from a hormonal perspective differently, knowing that we're getting that energy availability. And then the other side of it with carbs, or not carbs, well, carbs will be a huge theme, but with macros, and there's essentially three macros. I won't go too much into it, but it's carbs, fat, protein. And the very highest level of feedback I usually see in women is that they're usually cutting at least one of these macro groups significantly. And it sort of depends on the person, which one they're biasing against, either intentionally or not. But any depletion or like deficiency is a better word for in any of these macro groups is going to be an issue. And I think that one of the things that I commonly see on the macro side for women, especially who are trying to diet, is that they're cutting out or underestimating how much they'll need of that macro, especially carbs. And if you're active and you're an active woman, that carbs is something that if you are getting energy availability in terms of like you're getting the amount of nutrition that you need from a caloric perspective throughout the day, but you're cutting carbs, they've actually shown that you can get into an energy deficiency, which is disrupting, it's essentially under fueling, if you're under eating carbs alone. So if you're just under eating carbs, but that's the only thing that you're deficient in, that for women especially, that's a huge sensitivity for us because of how we process and metabolize our macros differently from men. And yet in a lot of diet culture, there's a demonization of carbs. And so that can be something that feels really incongruous for people. And there's still, I don't like to like go into specific numbers around any of these things because it really is specific to the person. It's specific to even like body type can play into it, genetics and all these other factors. But what I usually like to say is that if there's a specific macro group that you tend to be under eating, that can be a major issue in terms of how your body is responding to the deficiency it's seeing from that macro group. And all three of them are extremely important. And I often see women biasing against one of them. And oftentimes, if they are dieting, it tends to be carbs. That is the one that they are repelling against or avoiding, potentially intentionally, that could be causing likely unintentional consequences.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that that keto, I feel like, is the one that is the most restrictive when it comes to carbs historically, because even the Atkins style of approach is not even as restrictive on carbs as the ketogenic is. And medically speaking, ketogenic approaches can have some medical benefits if you're especially if you're approaching anything neurological. However, the threshold technically on paper, and again, this is a generality. So in order for you to actually know if you're in ketosis, you need to be testing with keto strips and or some sort of keto monitor. So, but generally the threshold is 50 grams of sugar per day. And that is so little if you really think about it, or 50 grams of carbs, I should say. Um, but also, eating more fat and protein is going to help you feel satiated longer, meaning feeling full. So you're not going to feel like you have to eat as often if you're getting the adequate amounts of fat and protein together. So So it's important, like you said, to have a balance and to know that you can, like, let's say maybe you're historically an overeater of carbs. I mean, lots of people have love affair with, carb heavy foods, breads, pastas, rice, beans, desserts, all those things. So maybe it's, part of your lifestyle goals and modifications to shift things and maybe to, cut down on some of those. That's totally fine. You can do that. But like you said, your body still needs the fuel to make the muscle tissue to replenish what you've burned. And, because these are the building blocks of how our body functions. And so, and again, especially as we get older and we start to move through perimenopause and menopause, making sure that we're getting the balance of macros is really important. But with that being said, I've read and I've discussed this in terms of protein. Is it about 1 gram per a pound of goal body weight per day?
Yeah, and this is also going to depend on your activity level a little bit,
Mhm.
but there are like kind of heuristics that will say that it's about anywhere between like zero point 0.8 to 1.1 per pound of body weight for protein. And so this is another area where women sometimes underestimate how much protein that they'll need. And especially if you're active, then it is really key to combine the notion of energy availability in terms of the timing of when you're getting in certain meals, certain things that you're eating with the macros that you're considering. And an example of this tangibly could be, and I can even use my own experience as an example, which is that I would work out and then I wouldn't be hungry afterwards. And I think that a lot of people have that experience where it suppresses your appetite when you're really highly active like that. And yet for women, and this is also something that's fairly specific for women, that there's benefits to eating something pretty soon after you're working out. And so it's another instance where I will consciously, even if I'm not feeling an extreme amount of hunger at that time, or even any hunger, try to be diligent about getting protein in. And like my post workout, which will also include some carbs, it's usually a fairly balanced meal or snack that has an adequate amount of protein in right after that workout session, because I know it's going to help how my body will feel later in the day, how my muscles are going to feel the next day. And so it is an example where it kind of combines the two frameworks that I was mentioning. But yes, to your point, there are guidelines in terms of protein level intake. And I think there are some out there that even say it's as low as like zero point 0.8 to 1 kilogram, like per a gram per kilogram. And that is based on like the floor in terms of like the bare minimum that you would need to function. And it's not
Right.
considering any level of activity level. And so the more like, I guess, relevant guidelines that are usually applicable to women that are, especially who are active in any sort of way, tend to be a lot higher than like the bare minimum guidelines that they have in some circles, or you might hear it in some very generalized like nutrition guidance. And so you're right that it's a
Yeah.
lot higher than what you would see in
Well,
some of
even
the like, yeah.
yeah. So even like just put it into context. So even in the medical training community, so whether it's, registered dietitian or nutritionist or pharmacist, because we actually not prescribe, but create nutrition programs for patients in the hospital sometimes. And those numbers, they are literally just to prevent malnutrition. So especially the low end of them. And
Mhm.
so again, like if think about the context of when this stuff was studied, it was studied, in the very early 1900s, so the early 20th century. It was, all ages, all genders, but mostly men, not a lot of women. And it was literally just to keep people out of certain diseases that we were starting to understand that were caused by vitamin deficiencies too. So, and then I'm also referring to like the recommended micronutrient amount. So like vitamin D or vitamin C or some of these minerals too that we supplement with. The RDA, so the recommended daily amounts, are so low. And it's literally just to prevent things like rickets or scurvy or, like these diseases that are caused by a true deficiency and or malnutrition. And so the optimal amounts could be completely different, and we really don't even know what those are, again, because we have some amazing research going on in this day and age, the 21st century. We're just now starting to get a concept and a hold on what are the optimal amounts. Like, no, you need more than 400 units of vitamin D to have a healthy vitamin D level. Like you probably need more like 10,000 IUs a day. If 5,000 IUs is actually, not enough for most people that are not getting enough sunlight exposure, because your body can make some on its own. But if you're sitting in an office all day and you don't get any sunlight, then your body's not making any, but it is using it. And so that's the other thing, is like, are you replenishing the amount that you're using? And if you're deficient, are then you supplementing with enough to replenish your deficiencies? And so it can be a lot more complicated than a lot of allopathic healthcare like purports it to be, or even the media like, portrays it to be, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that that's sort of the pitfall that a lot of people, and myself included at certain points as well, have fallen into, which is that it's a really easy rabbit hole to fall down in terms
Mhm.
of trying to optimize in a space like nutrition, where it's something that you do multiple times a day, likely whenever you're eating, of course. And there are so many factors, and there's so much information, and there's also so much noise that it can get to a place where every single meal, every snack, every single time you're eating, it can cause so much anxiety trying to figure out what is the right thing, what is the optimal thing, how do I take all these factors into consideration? And so it, and I think that that is what leads to a lot of this overwhelm or like confusion or even restriction, intentionally or not, around food, because then there's a lot of conversations about what you shouldn't do or what's bad or what's going to kill you or what's going to make you fat, and like all this very extreme language. And I think that when it comes down to it, given that there's a lot of individuality still, and given that it's most important to get the fundamental like the basics correct, and a lot of the times, what I'm seeing with women is that the basics are not getting, we're wildly off on the basic principles. And potentially in service of trying to go down this very complicated path that can feel very intimidating in terms of, when we're talking about busy people, like how much bandwidth do you even have to be like thinking about this or counting exactly every single macro? And then what does that mean in terms of how much time you have? And then what if you go out to eat? And there's just all of these scenarios that can become really anxiety inducing around food. And so a huge principle in terms of the work that that ally and the woman that I'm working with are really focused on is alleviating that anxiety around food, because it can be a rabbit hole that feels completely unachievable, where the standards are really high and every single decision can feel wrong or questionable or guilt ridden. And that's just not an emotion that we really want to experience around food, and not around something that we're trying to do on a daily basis. And So I really, really like to bring home the point that it's very much understandable how we fall into a place like that, given how much information there is and how many decisions need to be made around nutrition. And a huge principle that I really like to lean into is, let's start with making sure we're getting the basics right. Let's start with simplifying something that feels really, really complex and empowering people to be able to navigate it in a way that doesn't feel right or wrong, good or bad, but rather something that feels good in your body, feels energizing and feels spontaneous, and still allows you to have other values and have other aspects of your life that will enable social connection or spontaneity or flexibility, that while also providing energy that will allow you to feel good and have your metabolism functioning, have your hormones working well, and give you the energy you need to do the things that you want to be doing, whether it's spending time with your family or doing a high pressure job or doing any sort of work, school, any commitments that you have. And I think that that's something that when we're messing up or just making like the mistakes in some of these like basic areas around energy availability because of all of the confusion that's going on, that we don't realize or underestimate how much that could be impacting us in areas that we might be dismissing and might be saying, oh, well, it's just part of my personality, or like, oh, these energy dips are just completely normal. And I think that that's something that has created a lot of the passion that I have in this space, which is realizing how much change we can enable for women who are potentially living in a chronic state where they're either under fueling or they're really not thinking about their energy availability, and how crucial that can be and game changing for women especially.
Yes, all very true and good things. So thank you so much. So where can people find you in order to follow you and check out what how they can work with you?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram at my name. So it's at Allison Yamamoto. And I do love to hear from folks, questions, comments, thoughts, experiences. I love to hear stories. So I would love if any of you are interested to DM me or reach out to me there. And then our company website for working with Ally is theallymethod.com. And there are resources there that are free, or you can go ahead and book a call for an initial chat, an initial consultation, and that can kick off the opportunity for us to work together. So I would love to hear from some of you.
Beautiful. Well, again, Allison, thank you so much for your time and your expertise and your passion about this topic. Again, very relevant, and I'm excited to hear feedback from the audience too, even more questions. So, if you're listening out there and you have a follow-up question, please reach out. Now, I love that you can actually add questions and comments on Spotify now. They've added that, so yay. But of course, on any of our socials, and also by email, of course. So again, thank you so much. And definitely check out Allison on social or her website, theallymethod.com. And these links will also live on the show notes page, which is drlaramay.com/podcasts. So thank you so much. And again, we will catch you on the flip side, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, absolutely.